Police ordered K9 to attack elderly black veteran. The dog's reaction shocked the entire park. Three officers surrounded the elderly black man on the park bench, their intentions clear. When they unleashed their K9 unit with a single command, everyone expected violence. But Shadow the police dog had served in Afghanistan, and he recognized something in Dominic Reed that his handlers couldn't see. Riverside Park stretched along the waterfront like a green ribbon, its walking paths dotted with joggers and families enjoying the crisp Saturday morning. Children's laughter echoed from the playground while elderly couples fed ducks at the pond's edge. It was the kind of place where community happened naturally, where different worlds intersected in the shared space of public recreation. But beneath the surface, tranquility, invisible lines divided the park just as they divided the city. The east side, where the benches faced the water, was considered the nice section. The west side, where Dominic Reed sat reading his worn paperback novel, was where certain people were expected to stay. At 72, Dominic Reed carried himself with the measured dignity of a man who had seen too much but refused to be broken by it. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes clean but showing their age. The book in his weathered hands was a biography of Frederick Douglass, a choice that spoke to both his education and his understanding of history's long arc. Dominic had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a Marine Corps sergeant, leading men through jungles where the enemy could be anyone, and death came without warning. He'd earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star medals that now sat in a shoebox in his small apartment, gathering dust alongside commendation letters he'd never shown anyone. Since returning from the war 50 years ago, Dominic had worked as a postal worker, raised 3 children as a single father after his wife died young, and volunteered at the VA hospital every weekend. He'd never asked for special treatment, never demanded recognition for his service. All he wanted was the simple dignity of sitting in a public park, reading his book and watching the world go by. But in America, even that simple desire could become complicated when you were a black man in the wrong neighborhood. The 3 police officers who approached Dominic's bench that morning weren't responding to any crime. No one had called 911, no disturbance had been reported. They were simply patrolling, and in their minds, an elderly black man sitting alone in the nice part of the park was worth investigating. Officer Tyler Vaughn led the group, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Behind him, officers Martinez and Foster flanked out in a formation designed to intimidate. Foster's K9 partner Shadow walked at heel, a German Shepherd, whose presence alone was meant to send a message about who belonged in this space and who didn't. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Vaughn called out as the trio approached Dominic's bench. His tone carried the false politeness that barely concealed suspicion. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Dominic looked up from his book, marking his place with a finger. He'd been through this before, not in this exact park, but in countless other situations where his presence was questioned simply because of his skin color. "Reading," he replied calmly. "It's a public park." "I understand that," Vaughn continued, stepping closer. "But we've had some complaints about suspicious activity in this area. Mind if I see some identification?" The request hung in the air like a challenge. Dominic knew his rights. He wasn't required to show ID unless he was suspected of a crime. But he also knew the reality of the situation. Refusing would only escalate things, and at his age, escalation could turn dangerous quickly. "Of course, officer," Dominic said slowly, reaching into his jacket pocket. His movements were deliberate, visible, designed to avoid any misunderstanding that could give the officers an excuse to use force. Dominic handed over his driver's license along with something else, his military ID card, the one that identified him as a retired Marine Corps sergeant with an honorable discharge. He'd learned over the years that sometimes his service record could bridge the gap that his skin color created. Vaughn examined both cards with theatrical skepticism, holding them up to the light as if checking for forgeries. "Vietnam, huh?" he said with a smirk. "You don't look old enough to have served in Vietnam." "I was 18 when I enlisted," Dominic replied evenly. "Served 2 tours between 1969 and 1972. "Uh-huh." Vaughn handed the cards to Officer Martinez, who gave them the same suspicious examination. "You know, we see a lot of fake military IDs these days. People trying to get discounts, sympathy, whatever." The accusation hit Dominic like a physical blow. In all his years of dealing with discrimination, having his military service questioned was perhaps the cruelest cut. He'd bled for this country, lost friends in rice paddies half a world away, and came home to a nation that treated him like a second-class citizen despite his sacrifice. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up." Vaughn ordered, his hand moving to his handcuffs. "We're going to need to verify these documents." "Verify them how?" Dominic asked, but he complied, rising slowly from the bench. His knees protested old wounds from Vietnam, combined with decades of physical labor, but he maintained his dignity. "We'll run them through the system, make sure you are who you say you are," Martinez chimed in. "In the meantime, you'll need to come with us." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of three police officers confronting an elderly man reading a book. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Others simply watched with the morbid curiosity that accompanies public confrontations. Dominic looked around at the faces watching him, some sympathetic, others indifferent, a few openly hostile. This was his community, the city where he'd lived and worked for 50 years, and yet he felt like a stranger in a foreign land. "Officers," he said quietly, "I haven't committed any crime. I'm just sitting in a public park reading a book. What exactly am I being detained for?" The question hung in the air unanswered because there was no good answer that didn't expose the racial profiling at the heart of the encounter. Word spread quickly through the park as more people noticed the confrontation. Joggers slowed their pace. Families with children moved closer, and elderly couples interrupted their morning walks to see what was happening. The gathering crowd created its own dynamic, some people genuinely concerned about justice, others drawn by the spectacle, and a few who seemed to enjoy watching a black man being humiliated by police. Among the onlookers was Maria Santos, a local teacher who recognized Dominic from the VA hospital where she volunteered. She began recording with her phone, understanding instinctively that documentation might be the only protection Dominic had. Her hands shook slightly as she held the device, knowing she was witnessing something that could easily spiral out of control. "That's Dominic Reed," she whispered to the woman beside her. "He volunteers at the VA hospital. He's one of the kindest men I've ever met." But Officer Vaughn seemed energized by the attention, rather than deterred by it. In his mind, he was demonstrating police authority to a community that needed to understand who was in charge. The fact that his target was an elderly veteran reading a book seemed irrelevant to the larger message he wanted to send. "You know what?" Vaughn said, his voice carrying across the growing crowd. "I think we need to search this gentleman for weapons. Can't be too careful these days." Officer Foster stepped forward with Shadow, the German Shepherd, who had been trained for both drug detection and suspect apprehension. The dog was magnificent, 90 pounds of muscle and intelligence, with alert ears and eyes that missed nothing. His presence alone was enough to make most people compliant. "Shadow here is going to help us make sure you're not carrying anything dangerous," Foster announced loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I suggest you remain very still." But as Foster began to give Shadow the command to search, something unexpected happened. The dog's ears perked up, and he tilted his head as if hearing something his handler couldn't. Shadow had been trained to respond to specific commands, to be an extension of his handler's will. But he was also a veteran himself, a military working dog who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining the police force. And military working dogs, like their human counterparts, developed an ability to read people that went beyond their formal training. Shadow approached Dominic slowly, his body language shifting from the aggressive posture Foster expected to something more curious, more cautious. The dog's nose worked the air, picking up scents that told a story his human handlers couldn't read. What Shadow smelled was familiar, the lingering traces of military life that never quite leave a veteran's clothes, the particular soap used in VA hospitals, the medications that many older veterans take for service-connected injuries. But more than that, he sensed something in Dominic's demeanor that he recognized from his own service. Military working dogs learn to distinguish between threats and allies, between those who mean harm and those who protect. They develop an almost supernatural ability to read human intentions, to sense fear, aggression, or calm authority. And what Shadow sensed from Dominic was the quiet confidence of someone who had led others in dangerous situations, who had earned the right to command respect. The dog stopped just inches from Dominic, his tail beginning a tentative wag. Instead of the aggressive search Foster expected, Shadow sat down and looked up at the elderly veteran with what could only be described as recognition. "What the hell?" Foster muttered, tugging on the leash. "Shadow, search!" But Shadow had made his own decision. Instead of following his handler's command, the dog moved closer to Dominic and gently nuzzled his hand. It was a gesture of affection, of recognition, of solidarity between two veterans who had served in different wars, but understood the same truths about duty and sacrifice. Dominic looked down at the beautiful animal and felt something break loose in his chest, not fear or anger, but a profound sadness for how far his country had fallen from its ideals. Here was a dog trained to be a weapon, showing more wisdom and compassion than the men who commanded him. "Easy, boy," Dominic whispered, gently stroking Shadow's head. "I know. I know." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the police dog continued to show affection to the man the officers were treating as a threat. Cell phone cameras captured every moment, the footage already being uploaded to social media, where it would soon go viral. Officer Vaughn's face reddened with embarrassment and anger. His carefully orchestrated display of authority was being undermined by his own K-9 unit. "Foster, get control of your dog." But Shadow remained where he was, a living testament to the fact that sometimes animals possess a moral clarity that humans have lost. Officer Vaughn's patience finally snapped. The growing crowd, the cell phone cameras, and now his own K-9 unit, refusing to cooperate, had turned what should have been a simple intimidation tactic into a public relations nightmare. In his mind, there was only one way to regain control of the situation. "Foster," he barked, his voice carrying a new edge of desperation. "I want that dog to take this suspect down. Now." The command sent a chill through the crowd. People who had been casually observing suddenly understood that they might be about to witness something terrible. Maria Santos gripped her phone tighter, making sure she was still recording. Several parents began pulling their children away from the scene. "Sir, I don't think that's—" Foster began, but Vaughn cut him off. "I don't care what you think. That man is resisting arrest, and your dog is going to help us subdue him. Give Shadow the attack command." Foster looked down at his partner, who was still sitting calmly beside Dominic, occasionally looking up at the veteran with what appeared to be adoration. The dog showed no signs of aggression, no indication that he perceived any threat from the elderly man. "Shadow," Foster called reluctantly, "attack." The command echoed across the park like a gunshot. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen when 90 pounds of trained police dog was unleashed on a 72-year-old man whose only crime was reading a book while black. Shadow heard the command clearly. His ears perked up and his body tensed slightly, but he didn't move from Dominic's side. Instead, he looked back at his handler with what could only be described as confusion, as if he couldn't understand why he was being asked to attack someone who posed no threat. Military working dogs are trained to follow commands without question, to be living weapons in the hands of their handlers. But they're also trained to think, to assess situations, to distinguish between real threats and false alarms. And every instinct Shadow possessed told him that Dominic Reed was not a threat. "Attack," Foster repeated, his voice rising with frustration and embarrassment. "Shadow, attack." But the dog remained motionless, except for his tail, which continued its gentle wagging. He looked up at Dominic again, then back at his handler, as if trying to communicate that there had been some terrible misunderstanding. The crowd watched in amazement as the police dog continued his act of civil disobedience. Here was an animal trained to be an instrument of law enforcement, refusing to participate in what he somehow understood to be an injustice. "What's wrong with your dog?" Vaughn demanded, his face now bright red with anger and humiliation. "I don't know," Foster admitted. "He's never done anything like this before." Dominic continued to stroke Shadow's head gently, his own eyes filling with tears. In this moment of crisis, when 3 armed police officers were trying to intimidate and humiliate him, the only creature showing him kindness was a dog who had never met him before, but somehow recognized him as a fellow warrior. "It's okay, boy," Dominic whispered. "You're a good dog. You know right from wrong." The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Shadow remained at Dominic's side, Foster continued to call commands that went unheeded, and Vaughn grew increasingly agitated as he realized his authority was being undermined by a dog. Then from the crowd, a voice called out, Dominic Reed." An elderly white man pushed through the gathering people, his face a mixture of recognition and disbelief. He was well-dressed, clearly affluent, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. "My God, it is you," the man said as he approached. "Officers, what's going on here?" Vaughn turned toward the newcomer, grateful for any distraction from his humiliation. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This is police business." "Police business?" the man replied, his voice rising with indignation. "This man is a war hero. Sergeant Dominic Reed saved my life in Vietnam." The words hit the crowd like an electric shock. Cell phones that had been recording now focused on the new arrivals, sensing that the story was about to take another dramatic turn. The man who had stepped forward was Nathaniel Cross, and he was about to change everything. Nathaniel Cross was 70 years old, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of wealth and influence. As the retired CEO of Cross Industries, he was accustomed to being listened to, respected, and obeyed. But more importantly, he was a man who had never forgotten a debt. "Officers," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding boardrooms. "I am Nathaniel Cross. I sit on the city council, and I'm telling you that you are making a terrible mistake." Vaughn's demeanor shifted slightly. He recognized the name. Cross Industries was one of the city's largest employers, and Nathaniel Cross was exactly the kind of influential citizen that police departments tried to keep happy. "Mr. Cross," Vaughn said, his tone becoming more respectful, "we're just investigating suspicious activity. This man couldn't provide adequate identification." "Couldn't provide adequate identification?" Nathaniel's voice rose with incredulous anger. "This man is Sergeant Dominic Reed, United States Marine Corps. He saved my life and the lives of 11 other Marines in a firefight outside Da Nang in 1971. If his military ID isn't adequate identification for you, then you need to reconsider your definition of adequate." Nathaniel turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the park. "I was 19 years old, scared out of my mind, pinned down by enemy fire with my squad. We were going to die in that jungle, and we all knew it." He pointed at Dominic, who stood quietly beside the still defiant Shadow. "This man, Sergeant Reed, crawled through enemy fire to reach us. He coordinated our extraction, carried wounded Marines to safety, and held off the enemy until helicopters could get us out. He saved 12 lives that day, including mine." The crowd listened in rapt attention as Nathaniel continued. "I went home to build a business empire. Dominic went home to work in a post office and raise his children alone after his wife died. He never asked for anything, never sought recognition. And this is how we treat our heroes." The weight of his words settled over the park like a heavy blanket, making everyone, especially the three police officers, acutely aware of the magnitude of their mistake. "You know what's really remarkable," Nathaniel said, looking down at Shadow, who remained loyally at Dominic's side. "This dog recognized what you three couldn't see. He knew he was in the presence of a warrior, a protector, someone who had earned respect through blood and sacrifice." Shadow looked up at Nathaniel as if understanding the praise, his tail wagging more vigorously. The dog had become the unlikely hero of the story, the one creature present who had shown perfect moral clarity in a situation where humans had failed. "Military working dogs are trained to recognize threats," Nathaniel continued, "but they're also trained to recognize allies. Shadow here served in Afghanistan, I can tell by his bearing his scars. He knows a fellow veteran when he sees one." Ediwara Foster looked down at his partner with new understanding. Shadow hadn't been defying his commands, he had been following a higher law, the unwritten code that exists between warriors regardless of species. The revelation of Dominic's heroism and Nathaniel's testimony transformed the atmosphere in the park completely. What had begun as a routine case of racial profiling had become a public reckoning with America's treatment of its veterans and its ongoing struggle with systemic racism. People in the crowd began to speak up, their voices growing stronger as they realized they were witnessing something historic. "This is wrong," someone called out. "Leave him alone," shouted another. The cell phone cameras that had been documenting the confrontation now became instruments of accountability, ensuring that this moment would be preserved and shared. Maria Santos stepped forward, her teacher's instincts compelling her to speak truth to power. "I know Mr. Reed from the VA hospital," she announced to the crowd and the officers. "He volunteers there every weekend reading to wounded veterans, helping them with paperwork. He's one of the most respected men in our community." Officer Vaughn found himself in an impossible position. He had initiated a confrontation based on racial profiling, escalated it through intimidation tactics, and now stood exposed before a crowd of witnesses and multiple recording devices. His authority had been undermined not just by a dog's refusal to attack, but by the revelation that his target was a decorated war hero. Martinez and Foster exchanged uncomfortable glances, both realizing that their careers could be over, depending on how this situation was resolved. Foster looked down at Shadow, who continued to sit calmly beside Dominic, and felt a mixture of pride and shame. Pride in his partner's moral clarity, shame in his own failure to see what the dog had recognized immediately. "Sir," Foster said quietly to Vaughn, "maybe we should just—" "Shut up!" Vaughn hissed, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. He was a man drowning in his own prejudices, unable to admit error, but equally unable to continue his course of action. Nathaniel Cross stepped closer to the three officers, his voice dropping to a tone that was somehow more threatening than shouting. "Gentlemen, I want you to think very carefully about your next move. This entire incident has been recorded by dozens of people. It will be on social media within minutes on the evening news tonight and in the newspapers tomorrow morning." He gestured toward Dominic, who remained dignified despite everything he had endured. "You have three choices. You can apologize to Sergeant Reed and walk away learning from this experience. You can continue this charade and face the consequences when the story goes viral. Or you can escalate further and guarantee that your careers in law enforcement are over." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the climax was approaching. Shadow remained at Dominic's side, a living symbol of loyalty and moral clarity. The elderly veteran himself stood quietly, his dignity intact, despite the humiliation he had suffered. "What's it going to be, officers?" Nathaniel asked. "Are you going to do the right thing? Or are you going to let your prejudices destroy your futures?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge waiting for an answer that would define not just this moment, but the character of everyone involved. Officer Vaughn's response came not in words but in action. Without speaking, he turned and walked away from the confrontation, his fellow officers following behind him. It wasn't an apology, but it was a recognition that the situation had become untenable. Shadow remained with Dominic until Foster called him back, the dog reluctantly leaving his new friend's side. The crowd erupted in applause as the officers retreated, but Dominic raised his hand for quiet. "This isn't about victory," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the park. "This is about understanding. Those officers made assumptions based on what they saw, not who I am. We all do that sometimes." Nathaniel Cross embraced his old sergeant, tears streaming down both men's faces. "I've been looking for you for 50 years, Nathaniel whispered. "I never got to thank you properly." The crowd began to disperse, but many people approached Dominic to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, to apologize for what they had witnessed. The video footage of Shadow's refusal to attack Dominic went viral within hours, generating millions of views and sparking a national conversation about police training, racial profiling, and the treatment of veterans. The image of the police dog showing affection to the elderly black veteran became a symbol of moral clarity in an age of confusion. The police department launched an internal investigation, and all three officers were eventually disciplined. Vaughn was terminated, while Martinez and Foster received mandatory retraining on bias and de-escalation techniques. The department also implemented new policies requiring officers to verify military service records before questioning veterans' identification. Nathaniel Cross used his influence to establish a scholarship fund for children of veterans, naming it in Dominic's honor. The two men reunited after 5 decades, became close friends, their bond forged in combat and strengthened by this unexpected encounter in a public park. 6 months later, Dominic returned to the same park bench where the confrontation had occurred. This time he wasn't alone. Shadow, now retired from police service, sat beside him as his new companion, a gift from Officer Foster, who had realized that his partner had found where he truly belonged. As Dominic read his book, Shadow kept watch, a guardian who understood that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with dignity, courage in the simple act of refusing to participate in injustice. Sometimes the most powerful resistance comes from knowing when not to attack.